Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to bring this message to you on a really tough subject today. And how does a good God allow suffering? Or maybe it's better described as the problem of evil. This is one of the most challenging theological debates that can divide Christians and denominations. So let's engage in some of those perspectives on some of the possible issues or concerns surrounding this really difficult subject. First and foremost, there is no actual exact answer to this question, but we will suggest that God permits evil to possibly allow for the human will to develop character, or actually maybe even for the greater unseen purposes of God, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. So let's break this down. Free will or man's choices. What is free will? This is the human's ability to actually choose good or evil. And many scholars actually argue that God granted us this free will so that we could choose to live and obey him out of our own accord. And I'm sure you've heard countless sermons on why God allowed this, because he didn't want a company of robotic type obedience. Now, with what is the risk with all of this, with this type of power God has bestowed upon mankind? Is that power for ultimate good, or the freedom to do evil? So, we understand that the fall, the broken world around us, it's a direct result of the sin of disobedience, and it started with Adam and Eve in the garden. And this introduced death and chaos into creation. But it's at this conjunction that God entered into, and he actually participated through Christ Jesus, who suffered terrible persecution on that cross, and he endured the ultimate injustice and secured the future victory over suffering for us, proving that he wasn't just observing evil, but he entered into its consequences with us. He never left us alone. We don't suffer alone. And have you ever wondered, for love to be actual, genuine and good and authentic, freely giving our love and forgiveness to those who absolutely don't deserve it, and have caused us to suffer terribly, is consequently God allowing the possibility of evil, therefore creating a possibility of genuine love through us to actually exist in those circumstances. Romans 6 verse 23 says that the wages of sin is death. Man's free to choose. He can choose good or he can choose wrong, but that has severe consequences through disobedience and wrong choice. We can be so quick to blame God when we are the ones not living by his standards. God never stood at a distance. And as you read about God's attributes and you see his beautiful character on display throughout history, you see a pattern of God dealing with the problem of evil and suffering, even unto the ultimate payment paid by his son. God was intervening in evil circumstances. God may have purposes that might be beyond our human comprehension, because we don't always see the big picture like God does. And just because we don't understand the reason behind so much suffering around us doesn't mean one doesn't exist. Only God sees the beginning to the end. And there are many examples in the Old Testament of wars that needed to be fought so that God's people could survive. Let's just take a look at the book of Esther, for instance. Genocide was on the agenda because of evil intentions. If Esther had not obeyed God in the midst of injustice, an entire race would have ceased to exist. And if the Israelites had actually obeyed God in that wilderness and wiped out the entire race of the Amalekites, as God commanded, would Haman's hatred for the Jews have been passed down through generations, therefore forcing Esther to risk her life. And yet we tend to still blame God. But in all of this, God himself suffered with his creation. Remember, he's called the man of sorrows. So, he completely emphasizes with our human pain, defeating it through the resurrection. And look, through Jesus, God endured betrayal, torture, death, showing God sometimes uses man's evil deeds for his good purposes. And there's another shining example in the word. Joseph, for instance, whose own brothers sold him into slavery in Genesis 50 verse 20. You intended it for evil, but God intended it for good. And we know God used Joseph to save his entire family as well as all of Egypt. God can and he does use human acts of evil and all the suffering that goes along with it for other people's good. Maybe we can view the effects of suffering as drawing us actually closer to God. 2 Corinthians 1 verse 8 to 9 says that we endure suffering in order that we don't trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. You know, sometimes God really does intervene by taking our suffering away, but in reality, and I think many of us understand this, that he lovingly intervenes by meeting us and comforting us in our suffering. And if you have any doubts about this, look at the book of Revelation, where Jesus actually is so attentive to the suffering of the saints that his return to establish the New Jerusalem will be prompted by the death of that last martyr. And that's in the book of Revelation 6 verse 10 to 11. Have you ever noticed, and this is another thing I want to insert here, have you ever noticed that some of the strongest Christian churches are those that are the most persecuted? Look at China, Sudan, Nigeria. They understand the terrible price that Christ paid, and therefore they are in turn, like they turn to God as their personal God who understands their suffering because they endure so much. And Corrie ten Boom, she once wrote from the depth of that concentration camp that she was in, no matter how deep the darkness, he is deeper still. So you see, although we don't have a clear answer to everyone's suffering and everyone's circumstances, our Christian apologetic in the end does invite us into that trusting relationship with God, knowing that one day we're going to live in a place where suffering will be forever removed and replaced with joy, a place called heaven. We were made for a person and a place, and that person is Jesus, and that place is heaven. The suffering and the evil that we endure in this here and now as we live under the natural consequences of sin's curse will have no place in our future, and that's something to look forward to. I hope this message has blessed you all. God bless.